Thank you to everyone that joined, and thank you to RubyConf Pakistan for letting me present this. Um, so let's start with an overview of our talk today, um, and we'll get into the details about this a little bit later. But I suppose an overview would be best. So we're going to start with a little bit about me, see a little bit about this talk, discuss a little bit about the prerequisites that you should have before we dive into what this talk is about. Then we're going to discuss what service objects really are, why you might need them. We'll go over a scenario where you might use service objects. We might, then we'll discuss implementing them in this scenario itself. We'll talk about how we could improve the implementation we'd used of our service objects. And then we'll add another scenario where we use business logic, complicated business logic with service objects. And then finally, we'll end with this do's and don'ts of service objects, some things that you should consider doing, and then some things you should almost never consider doing when working with service objects. And then we'll end this with a little bit of Q&A. So I guess the first thing that we should begin with is a little bit about me, a little bit about this talk, and the prerequisites for this talk. So let's start with, a little bit about me. So my name is Amin Gillani. I'm the interim CTO at Patari. Patari is a music streaming service, a Pakistani music audio streaming service. Actually, we encompass a lot of things. I am an OMSCS, that means an online master's in computer science student at Georgia Tech. I'm a freelance software engineer and a former publications editor at Toptal. It's a network of elite freelance developers. I founded 2 companies in the past, both of them built on Ruby on Rails. I love signal hunting, which I do with the Pakistan Amateur Radio Society. I love Ruby on Rails, React.js. I've been exploring a lot of Vue.js recently. And I like dealing a lot, of a lot of technology related to cryptocurrencies and Web 3.0, which ties in with blockchain tech and cryptocurrencies. I love developing stuff and then wrapping them in Docker containers so that they're easy to use with CI/CD. And most of all, I love writing technical articles. In fact, this talk itself is based on a technical article I wrote on service objects. If you'd like to connect with me, I am my LinkedIn URL is linkedin.com/in/Amin Gillani. By the way, I also happen to be a Ruby Association certified Ruby Gold programmer. This is one of those really geeky things that I almost always get very excited about when I talk to Ruby developers. That's Max's signature right there at the bottom of this certification. So I have a piece of paper that says I am certified to be a gold standard Ruby programmer, and it's signed by Max. I don't recommend getting certified. It's not something that I advocate, but it is something that I decided to get, and I did get, and it's like one of those things that I'm extremely proud of, especially when I speak to other Ruby developers about it. One more thing that I would like to mention is that Patari is hiring. We have roles opening us for Node.js developers, Angular developers, and iOS developers. So if you fit either one of these, please get in touch with me. My email address is amin@patari.pk. So let's move on from me and discuss a little bit about this talk. This talk is based on a Toptal published article of mine of the same name, which is where we're getting the illustrations for this article from. Thank you, Toptal. Also, I'd like to thank the community at Toptal. Like a lot of the things that guided a lot of these things were from the community at Toptal. They're based on those discussions. Questions. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below and we will discuss these at the end. If you want the slides for this talk, this would be a great time to screenshot this. I'm going to smile and give you a thumbs up. You should screenshot right now and just keep this open in another window so that you can follow along. I know live streams can be a bit tricky, but moving on, before you start, I'd like to talk to you about the prerequisites and a bit about you before you dive into this talk. Now, this isn't a hard set of prerequisites, but it's probably nice if you fit these. I'd expect that you've built a few complex Ruby on Rails applications. Understand fairly well what Rails' MVC pattern is. You understand what the fat models and skinny controller mantra is. And you understand how Ruby's inheritance works. This is fairly important, and it's incredibly nice to have a good understanding, in fact, of Ruby's inheritance and agent class itself. A fair bit of warning. We're going to be bending Rails a bit, so please ensure you're comfortable with the defaults before proceeding on to this talk. It's not that you can't work with this it's not that you can't work. If you don't have that high of a level of understanding, if you find that level of understanding too high, it's not that you can't watch this presentation, but it would be nice if this is recorded. You can watch this, go back, understand these things, and then come back and watch this again at a later time. So moving on, let's go back to what this talk is about, and we're going to discuss and get to the main thing: service objects. Now, service objects or service objects, are they by aliens? No, they're not. Let's discuss the what and the why. What are they, and why would you use them? So, when we discuss Ruby on Rails in general, it's an MVC framework, and MVC is usually great for simple CRUD applications. We have controllers that process logic around requests and models that are abstractions over database records and views that render browser output, and this is a great model. But then, we're given this ideology that controllers should be skinny and then models should remain fat. And this is still great for simple CRUD operations. But, in the end, when you start building complex applications, you start seeing that your controllers become a little bit fat and your models are also fat. And this isn't really great for anyone. In situations like this, where your code, regardless, if you have a complex application with complex business logic and multi-model operations as well as API operations, regardless of whether or not you use a worker queue to process them, it becomes a little difficult for you to understand where to put your code. And in those situations, it's a great idea to use something a little bit different. Services, on the other hand, they encapsulate all that complex business logic into single callable Ruby objects. They make your code readable, easy, testable, and maintainable. They make your code good enough to publish publicly on GitHub, and isn't that what you want at the end of the day? Like code that you're proud of. Now, it isn't all about vanity though. I don't always create service objects immediately. I only create them when they're required. I create them when I'm doing a refactoring of my project and I realize that there's a lot of code that doesn't belong either in the model or a controller. And I like to call services individual business actions because they're business actions themselves. Now, let's see what a request lifecycle would look like with MVC and a service objects. With a service object. Oh, by the way, I should probably mention you want to create a lot of service objects. So unlike with controllers and models, When you put business logic in there, there's one business object per service object is how I usually want to use them. So let's see how this would generally work. So if you want a general description of service object, here it is. Service objects are Ruby classes that encapsulate a single business action. And these are all three different descriptions that I use. They're microservices inside your monolithic Ruby on Rails application. They're single business actions that you can execute as code. But you know, let's discuss how it is with this scenario. And that scenario is a third-party API client. So in this, for example, let's see how a service object would fit within a typical request. So a controller processes a request, a model fetches a database value, but in this particular instance, we can see that the service object fetches a market rate. As we can see, a user at the top calls and asks our application what their Bitcoin balance is worth. This request is handled by the controller, and the controller has to get everything together and send in a response, right? And the response is that your BTC is worth $7,000. You have one BTC and it is worth $7,000. Excuse me. So it needs that value of one BTC, which the app already knows and it'll get from its model. Then it needs the other thing it needs is that the conversion rate, 7,000 BTC to USD, which it can get from a third-party API. So what it does here is it gets it through a service object. And then the last thing it does is it uses all this data and then plugs it into a view. And then using that view, using all that that view is what it renders into this response and sends to the user. Now, that's how a service object with a third-party API would work, theoretically. But let's see how we could implement that with code. And I don't have to jump out into a demo here because I have all that here. Now, we can take, for example, Eric Berlin's Twitter gem. A scenario that you could possibly use a service object for, and I'm not saying that there are not other ways to do it, is you could take a user's input and create a tweet. Now, where does this code belong? It's a client. If you look at this closely, you're creating a client object with configuration, which is a consumer key, a consumer secret, an access token, and then access token secret. All these values you would probably get from Twitter. And then you create a client object, and then you pass a string to the update method of that client object, and that's it. That's how you create that tweet. But if your objective is to take a user's input and create a tweet, you would most likely put this into your controller, because where else would you put it, right? Now, that could work, but I would argue that putting it into the controller, does that really belong there? Let's explore that question for a second. This code doesn't really belong inside a controller now, does it? If you put it in a controller, you're going to make off-label use of a controller and make it fat. You could arguably put it into a concern, and a concern refactors common code. But you're not really refactoring common code here. You're making off-label use of a concern, which, once again, you're free to do, but it's not really valid use of a concern. I would argue that the best place to do it would be to put it in a service object. A service object named tweetCreator, whose only purpose is to create a tweet. And that's it. That's the only job of this service object. It contains the business logic. It's a simple Ruby object which contains the business logic to create tweets. Now, this is a sample application, and I would normally not do this, like create a service object that creates tweets, but this is still a valid use case, and it's good for demonstration purposes. So how would I go about doing this if I were doing this? Now, let's see how the code for this would actually look like. Now, if we simply create an app/services folder, and then add a file, tweet_creator.rb, this file would automatically be auto-loaded. If you have the slides, I've added a link for you to learn more about how Rails handles auto-loaded paths. And then if you simply create a plain Ruby object inside with an adder reader for the message, an initializer that takes in the value of your message because it is a Ruby object, and then you could create your you could create that client immediately in a method called sendTweet, and then update the client, the same code that you used. You could use that instance. Sorry, you could use that that variable that you created, and then you could update the client with that variable, and then you would suddenly have a new tweet created. But when you call this, it looks like this. You would have to write tweetCreator.new.sendTweet, and then you would have to pass it a string. Now, the syntax is not ideal. That's understandable, but we can fix this later. But the idea here is that this has a few more improvements, and we can go over the improvements over here. Instead of calling 10 lines of code in your controller, which is a controller, I named it a controller, you're only adding one more line. Testing is more straightforward for Tweet Creator and a controller because they're both isolated pieces of code. New developers know what a controller does and can infer what Tweet Creator does. But that obviously doesn't matter because I'm sure you're still writing documentation. We can reuse the Tweet Creator anywhere without including a concern, so there's less code every time you use it. But we've identified that there's at least one problem. The syntax is not ideal. But are there more ways for us to improve our service object? Let's explore that for a second. What other problems do we have? So the current problems that we can see is that the syntax, a service, and then new, and then the action that we want to call onto that new instance of that class is kind of awkward. And that totally makes sense. We need syntactical sugar there. And then we would have hundreds of classes in the app/services folder, which means there would be a lot of clutter. So yes, that makes sense. As the application grows, we would be dumping all those objects there, and then we need a better way to organize them. Excuse me. And then, what do your service objects return? There's no specific rule about how to handle returns or errors, and that makes sense because there are no conventions around this. So let's explore what it is we can do. And we can explore these one by one. So what I think we should do is take the first one and work with that. Now, how do we add syntactical sugar and make that new call, slightly better? And there's precedence in Ruby for this. If you look at Ruby itself, how do we call chunks of code that are readily available? Well, chunks of code in Ruby are Procs. Well, there's plenty of ways to call chunks of code, but one of those ways is Procs. We have a method called proc.call, Now, proc.call, can we recreate our syntax around that to have our class simply be called with tweetcreator.call, and I'll give you a spoiler here. Yes, there is a way to do that. Excuse me, and I'll share that with you. The way we do that is using another Ruby convention, is by creating an application service in our application app/services folder. So in the app services folder, we create a new class, application service. And the code for application service is fairly simple. It's simply this. It's self-explanatory, isn't it? If it isn't, I'll explain what it does. It simply creates, if you call on this, it simply creates a new instance. The inherited instances of this class will simply, if you call on this class, it will create a new instance of the class and then pass it the arguments that you passed on it. Let's see how that works. So if you simply have your tweet creator service inherit from your application service, and then you rename the method that you rename the method that you put your code inside. What happens is you can simply call tweet creator, which is this, and then call on it. And what that'll do is instantiate a new instance of tweet creator. That's what the new does. And then call this method call with the parameters that you passed on to the parent. This makes, even if you don't understand the code, or if you or if you take your time to understand the code, what this simply does is it simply allows you to make this much easier to call, or better looking, in fact. So all your service objects that include application service simply need to have a call method, and that's it. That's where you put your code, and that's it. You call the service object and then call the call method on it. Now let's look at the problems that we had. We fixed the syntax that was slightly weird. The other problem that we have is that there's still the ability for all our service objects to clutter up in the app/services folder. So let's discuss how we can fix that. So let's walk through how it is that we organize services. How we can possibly organize the service objects and try to come up with a solution together. So service objects are single business actions. Service objects are essentially like hiring one person to do one task. And groups of service objects would then therefore be like groups of people performing similar tasks together. People in real life require managers to manage them, and managers are a great way to group teams. In the Ruby world, when it comes to groupings and namespaces, they're handled with Ruby modules. So when it comes to organizing service objects, we can namespace them within modules. So let's explore how this could possibly work. And as an example, let's try working with lots of Twitter actions. What we need is, we already have the tweet creator method. Let's service objects. Let's add an additional service object called profile follower, and a last service object called timeline fetcher. What they do is self-explanatory, but the profile follower follows your profile, and the timeline fetcher fetches all the tweets from your from a timeline that you've asked for. And then let's group them all under Twitter manager. Let's see how the directory service with this would work out. Under the services folder, we would still have the application service folder as it is. We would then create a new folder called Twitter Manager, and then we would dump all the service objects within this folder. We have the profile follower, the tweet creator, and the timeline fetcher, all within that folder. Now, how would they look like themselves? We can simply wrap them within modules, within a module called the Twitter Manager. What that does is that namespaces all the similar service objects together, so you can simply call them by appending the name of the manager before them. So the Twitter Manager and then the tweet creator can be called with the call method. That addresses the problem that we've had of hundreds of classes and apps/services leading to clutter, and then we can organize them better. But that leaves us with one last object. What do you return in your service object? And I have some ideas about this. In my personal opinion, what we can do is we can return three things: a Boolean, either true or false, a returned value, or an enum. And most importantly, I believe that you should handle your exceptions within the service objects. And I'll explain why later. But for now, let's look at the enum value. So for an enum value, what you have is you can group all your enums in you can declare all your enums in a constant at the class level, and then you can group them in, say, an array of. You can group them all within an array, a parent array of a returns constant. So what this does is this particular syntax. It does declare the partial success as a symbol. So it's essentially like declaring declaring constants, and then you can still, because constants are generally tied to the class itself, you can call this constant as exchange recorder slash and then as partial success under exchange recorder, but it's also callable as exchange recorder returns and then partial success. What that helps you is to do is determine whether or not it's been returned, and sort of helps you group together all the enums in a single place under the returns constant. And then what you can do is, depending on the state, you can return one of these constants. So this will be an example service object using enums, and then when you're in code, you can call your service object with the call method, and then you can test for the return value simply by saying if it's a success, if it's a failure, or if it's a partial success. So that honestly solves all three of our problems. And it lets us make a much better, a much more robust service object system. Now, with that said, I think we're ready to move on to a slightly more complex scenario. So let's discuss scenario number 2, complex business logic with API, database, and service object calls nested within service objects. Now this may sound complex, but it's not really that complex. And I'm fairly certain I can handle all of this within one slide. And this is how. It may sound complicated, but it really isn't once you know all the basics that we've discussed before. With this, you can have all of your service objects nested within a single module, Money Manager, as you can see. So here, what we have is we have 4 service objects. And this is essentially a currency exchange application. So let's discuss these service objects first. this service object, the exchange rate getter gets the exchange rate from an API. The exchange rate recorder records the exchange rate event in the money exchanges table. The um, and the currency transfer, it records the transfer of money from one account to another in money accounts. And then we have the the currency exchanger service object. And essentially what that does is it transfers, it does a lot of calls. And what it would do is it uses all these essentially to take your, to record a transaction where it gets the API, it gets the exchange rate, and then it does it does database calls, it does API calls, and it wraps all of this and other service object calls, and then it does all of this in itself, and then it also wraps all of this within one single transaction. And the best part about this is all business logic. If you were to chunk this off in your models, you could possibly end up, using callbacks within your models, and that would be hard for new developers to understand. But with this, it's business logic. And the absolute best part is that there are 4 isolated plain Ruby objects for you to test. New developers, when they look at these objects, they understand because it's functional code. And then the other thing is that when you call this within your controller, it's literally one line. So what's next? Let's discuss the things that you can do, that you should do, and the things you shouldn't do when it comes to using service objects. So let's first discuss when you should use service objects. The first question is, does your code handle routing, parameters, or other things that controllers usually do? If it's something like that, you shouldn't use a service object. That code just belongs in your router. There's no need to chunk that off. Service objects are generally for things like handling business logic. Are you trying to share your code in different controllers? If you are, that doesn't really mean that you should use a service object. It's possible for you to use a concern, and you should explore that. Is your code like a model that doesn't need persistence? If so, don't use a service object. Try using a non-active record model instead. It's possible for you to create a model that doesn't require persistence. And is your code a specific business action? Examples are take out the trash, or generate a PDF using this document, or calculate the customs duty using these complicated business rules, which is actually calculating the customs duty using complicated business rules is something I've actually had to deal with for a Pakistani e-commerce startup. Nazdeek, that was actually something we use service objects for extensively. And in this case, use the service object by all means. That code did not fit in any one of these, in models, views, or controllers. And it made no logical sense for it to go anywhere else. And that's it. That's where when you should use service objects. So with that said, are there rules for writing service objects? And personally, I do use rules. But you may break them, since we're all adults here, and you're obviously very capable Ruby developers. The first rule is that you should always use only one public method per service object. Service objects are single business actions, so you can change the name of your public method if you like. I prefer using call. But GitLab Community Edition, at least, the code base uses execute. And then there are other people that may use perform, but you can use whatever you like. You can call it Nerman for all I care. Just don't create two public methods for a single service object. Break it into two objects if you need to. There's no need for you to create, one service object with two public methods. If you need to share code, you can use inheritance there. They inherit off a module, so it's fine. Service objects are single business actions. Rule number 2. Name service objects like dumb roles at a company. Service objects are single business actions. So imagine if you hired one person at a company to do that one job. What would you call them? Is their job to create tweets? You can call them tweet creator. If their job is to read specific tweets, you can call them the tweet reader. The third rule is don't create generic objects to perform multiple actions. And that makes sense. I broke the functionality into two pieces, tweet reader and profile reader. What I didn't do is create a single generic object called Twitter handler and dump all the API functionality here. Please don't do this. This goes against the business action mindset, makes the service object look like the Twitter fairy. If you want to share code amongst business objects, just create a base Twitter manager object or module and mix all that into your service objects. So rule 4, handle exceptions inside the service object. And I can't stress this enough. Service objects are business actions. If you give that person, I use this example in my article. If you give if you have a person that reads tweet, they'll either give you a tweet or say that this tweet does not exist. And that's the response you want in your service object, right? You don't want your service error to just jump on your desk and say error. Just return false or whatever enum that you want to return and say, and let your controller move on from there. Don't hang the request entirely. The other question you may ask yourself is why bother at all? Why do we need to go down into the specifics of whether or not we need service objects? And that's, I don't know, why bother doing anything at all, I guess. It does make your code more structured, easier to understand, easier to test. It's much more easier to onboard new developers. It reduces the likelihood of RubyConf being unhappy since you're reducing your metrics ABC size errors and your metrics ABC class your metrics class length. And if you're not already doing MVC by including all this extraneous code into your controller, why call it MVC? So when I published this article, I did get a lot of criticisms, and they're all valid, and a lot of people do think about this. So these are just some of the people that raised counterpoints, and these are all, in their perspective, valid. And I'm partial to my own perspective. So these are valid reasons of why you should use service objects, shouldn't use service objects, and some people go as far as to say that they're an anti-pattern. I think that they're a very valuable resource. I certainly don't advocate using service objects for every single thing. I certainly wouldn't use, say, a Twitter service object. I would most likely use a non-persistent model for service for Twitter, but there are genuine cases where I've been glad to have service objects. But everyone has their own style of developing an application. These are just some criticisms of this style of development that have come across, and I think it's always nice to have a balanced perspective. So please feel free to explore these. These are actual hyperlinks in the slides, and I've shared these slides already. And choose whatever makes you comfortable. It is your code, and just have fun developing Ruby, because Ruby is a fun language. I'd like to thank everyone for coming here. I know this was a fairly long conversation. I just want to reiterate that the slides for this talk are available at this link. You can connect with me at this URL. It has all my social media links, and that Patari is hiring. Now we're going to switch over to Q&A. I'm going to go over some of these questions that we have lined up. Absolutely. So these are the link to the slide. These slides is right on your screen. I see that we don't really have a lot of questions. Huh. Thank you. Since I see that there aren't any questions, I'm just going to wrap it up. It was really nice, having this, and thank you, RubyConf, for hosting this, and thank you for everyone for having attended this. Have a great day, everyone. Goodbye.